The wind cut across the barren training field like a blade, carrying with it a silence so heavy that Private Thomas Hale felt it in his bones. It was February 1944, months before D-Day, and Fort Calhoun should have been alive with drills, shouts, and engines. Instead, it felt like a ghost camp, a place where conversations died in throats and footsteps were measured, cautious, and never too loud. Thomas never imagined that the nation he had sworn to defend would ever feel like this, watchful, suspicious, and in ways he could not yet name, dangerous. He noticed it first in the eyes of the guards. They didn't look at him and the others as fellow American soldiers, but as something foreign, something to be managed. Their rifles were held not casually across their shoulders, but tight against their chests, ready, aimed inward. Rumors had drifted through the barracks for weeks, whispers of a secret list, of names marked for special monitoring, of men who had been quietly removed from training companies and never returned. But rumors were common in wartime. Fear had a way of nibbling at truth until everything tasted like paranoia. Still, something was wrong. The morning the military police came for Staff Sergeant Luis Calderon, the truth finally stepped into the light. It was barely dawn when the heavy door to Barracks 12 exploded inward. Boots thundered, flashlights snapped on. Thomas jerked awake, blinking against the glare as 3 MPs stormed down the aisle. "Calderon, on your feet." Luis sat up slowly, confusion wrinkling his face. "What's going on, sir? What?" "Save it. You know why you're being detained." Detained? The word sliced through the room. Detained by their own government? For what? Luis raised both hands. "Sir, I don't—" "Get up," the MP barked. "You're under arrest on suspicion of enemy collaboration." A ripple of disbelief spread across the barracks. Enemy collaboration? Luis Calderon, the man who had volunteered as a translator because he spoke German from working in a Texas brewery with immigrant workers. The man who had saved 3 trainees from live fire panic. The man whose little sister sent cookies every week, always with a prayer written on top. Thomas stood without thinking. "Sir, there must be a mistake. Calderon hasn't done anything. He's—" A rifle swung toward his chest. "Private, step back." The cold authority in the MP's voice froze Thomas mid-sentence. The entire barracks fell silent as Luis was shoved toward the door, confusion twisting into fear. "Sir," Luis tried again, "please, at least tell me where you're taking me." The MP didn't answer. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving the barracks in stunned stillness. Luis never returned. By evening, word spread through the camp. Luis was being held at a new loyalty evaluation facility. Nobody knew what that meant. Some said it was interrogation. Others whispered it was internment. A few believed men like him, German-speaking Americans, Japanese-American volunteers, Latino translators, were being removed to avoid internal threats. Thomas didn't want to believe any of it, but he couldn't ignore the letters. They arrived in small stacks, unopened, marked with the red stamp, "Held for review, security." Mail censorship existed for soldiers going overseas, sure, but for men who hadn't even left American soil, that felt different, controlled, intentional. Thomas buried his worry until the night Sergeant Owens disappeared. Owens was no translator. He never spoke a foreign word except sayonara jokingly after chow. But he did have one thing working against him.
His grandparents were from Austria. He had mentioned it once during a routine background form. It was enough. 2 days later, an MP pulled Thomas aside. "Hale, grab your kit. You're requested at HQ." Requested. The word tasted like a warning. He followed the MP through the camp's central yard. A sharp wind rattled the barbed wire that surrounded Fort Calhoun. Thomas stared at the double fencing he had never noticed before. Why would a training camp need such heavy security? He felt suddenly trapped inside a cage he hadn't realized existed. When the office door opened, Captain Myers sat waiting. His uniform was crisp, ironed to perfection, his stare colder than winter. "Private Hale, sit." Thomas sat. Myers pressed his fingertips together. "You've been identified as someone of interest." Thomas blinked. "Sir?" "You were close with Calderon." "Yes, sir. He's a good soldier." "You defended him." Thomas swallowed. "Because he didn't do anything wrong." "That's not for you to decide, but your reaction is concerning." "Concerning?" "Sir, I don't understand." "You grew up in Minnesota, correct? Near Nome." The question hit Thomas like a slap. "Yes, sir." "A town founded by German immigrants." Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. "Sir, with respect, everyone there speaks English. We're Americans." "Of course, but heritage influences loyalties in unpredictable ways." Loyalties. The word echoed painfully. "Sir, are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting. I'm evaluating." When Thomas was escorted out, he wasn't taken back toward the barracks. He was taken past the vehicle depot, past the fuel station, past the chain-linked gates he had never been allowed to approach before. There, behind a second set of fences, stood a cluster of wooden buildings topped with watchtowers. A detention camp. Inside Fort Calhoun. His stomach twisted. He was shoved into a processing room, fingerprinted, stripped of his rifle, issued a canvas bag for personal effects. Then a guard walked him down a narrow hallway toward a holding cell. Inside, sitting on a bunk with his head in his hands, was Luis. "Tom?" Thomas stared. "Luis, what is this place?" Luis gave a hollow laugh. "They call it a loyalty center, but it's a prison, Tom. For us. For Americans." Thomas sank onto the opposite bunk. He'd trained to fight Nazis. Now he was locked up under the same flag he swore to defend. Days bled into each other. They were interrogated repeatedly, asked about family history, languages spoken, whether they had ever questioned American policy, whether they had read foreign newspapers, attended foreign church services, written letters in anything but English. Every answer felt like a trap. Luis explained that guards monitored everything, conversations, meals, even the books they checked out. One man had been punished for reading a German dictionary, another for writing to his parents in Japanese. "You know what the worst part is?" Luis said one night. "We volunteered. We showed up for this war ready to serve. But to them we'll always be suspects first, soldiers second." Through the thin walls, Thomas heard distant shouting, metal clanging, a man crying out. He didn't know how many were held here. Dozens, maybe hundreds. All Americans. All imprisoned.
Weeks passed. Rumors swirled that congressional investigators were coming, that newspapers were sniffing around the truth, that the War Department feared a scandal.
Then, one icy morning, the cell door flew open. A colonel marched down the hall shouting orders. "All detainees are being transferred, now!" "Transferred where?" Thomas asked. The guard ignored him. They were marched outside into blinding sunlight. Trucks lined the yard. Men climbed in under watchful rifles. Thomas glanced at the towers, at the American flag snapping above them. It felt wrong. All of it. As the truck rumbled toward the main road, Thomas saw something he would never forget. A group of new trainees marching on the open field, completely unaware that another world, an imprisoned world, existed just a few yards away. Freedom and captivity, side by side. 2 months later, the loyalty centers, never publicly acknowledged, were quietly dismantled. The Army reabsorbed detainees into different units, scattering them so no single group could speak with one voice. Thomas was shipped to Europe. Lewis was sent to the Pacific. Their files remained sealed, their stories classified, their loyalty questioned forever. But the memory of that camp burned in Thomas's mind like a scar, not because of the barbed wire or the interrogations, but because they were done by his own country, under the banner of liberty. War demanded sacrifice. Thomas had expected that. But he had never expected the sacrifice to be his name, his loyalty, his dignity. Years later, long after the war ended, the truth finally surfaced. Special detention centers had existed. Soldiers from suspect backgrounds had been monitored, interrogated, and imprisoned. No apologies were ever issued. No records officially acknowledged wrongdoing. But the men who lived through it remembered, and they never forgot how it felt to be shackled under their own flag. Freedom, Thomas learned, was not a guarantee, not even for the men sworn to defend it. And in the darkest corners of American history, loyalty had been judged not by actions, but by ancestry, language, and suspicion. That was the wound he carried long after the war ended, the knowledge that the enemy hadn't captured him. His own nation had.
The camp nobody spoke of. Secrets buried behind barbed wire. Inside forgotten detention sites, where truth was censored, identities erased, and loyalty questioned in the shadows of wartime fear. They said every secret leaves an echo, but the strange thing about Camp Briarwood was that it left nothing. No echo, no footprint, not even a rumor loud enough to leave a trail. It existed like a shadow pressed between the pages of American history, hidden so carefully that even decades later, veterans spoke of it only with lowered voices, if at all. Most Americans never knew their country once built a detention site so secret that soldiers who entered it disappeared from official rosters, from mail routes, even from family telegrams. And in the winter of 1943, Private Daniel Mercer learned the truth the hard way by becoming one of the men taken inside. The night the trucks came. No one at Fort Rockwell slept well on foggy nights. Fog had a way of dampening sound, swallowing footsteps, and making even the most familiar silhouette feel foreign. And on that night, the fog was thick enough to smother the stars. Daniel had been finishing late guard duty when he saw the first truck rumble onto the training field with its headlights off, then a second and a third, all unmarked, all escorted by MPs who looked as if they'd stepped out of a classified photograph. He paused on the gravel path. "Transfers?" Corporal Harris whispered beside him. But Daniel shook his head. Something in the air felt wrong, like standing too close to an electric fence, hearing the faint hum of danger even before you touched it. The MPs carried clipboards, not assignment lists, but thick folders stamped "Confidential." They called out names one by one,
Men walked toward the trucks silently, as if they already understood they had no choice. They weren't allowed bags. They weren't allowed weapons. They weren't allowed to ask where they were going. Daniel couldn't see their faces clearly, but he saw their fists clenched tight at their sides. The trucks rolled off into the fog, engines low, lights dark. By morning, their bunks were stripped and spotless, like they had never existed. That was the night Daniel first learned the Army had places no one talked about. Whispers in the barracks. At first, it sounded like rumor, the sort of wild story lonely soldiers invented to pass the endless nights. But the whispers grew. Nisei volunteers being taken away. German-American translators disappearing from language units. Men questioned for reading foreign newspapers. The whispers always came too quietly, always after lights out, always with quick glances at the barracks door. You didn't speak loudly about these things. You didn't speak to the wrong person. In wartime America, loyalty mattered more than truth, and sometimes the two no longer overlapped. Then one night, Private Lewis murmured the words Daniel would never forget. "My cousin was taken last month. They said he needed evaluation. He hasn't been heard from since." Daniel's throat tightened. "Evaluation for what?" Lewis looked up, fear shining in his eyes. "For being American enough." When the MPs came for Daniel. On a freezing January night, long after lights out, he heard the sound he had feared for weeks. Boots. Heavy boots, moving in a straight line toward Barracks 7. The door burst open. Flashlights blinded everyone at once. "Private Daniel Mercer, on your feet." Daniel felt his heart sink into his stomach. "Sir, what's happening?" "You're being reassigned." "At midnight?" A pause, a cold stare. "Orders from above. Gather your things." 2 guards grabbed his arms, not violently, but firmly enough to show the decision wasn't negotiable. The other soldiers remained silent, not because they didn't care, but because they knew speaking up would only get them added to the list. He was marched outside toward the same unmarked trucks he had seen weeks earlier. The sergeant leaned close. "Don't fight this, and don't ask questions." Daniel swallowed hard. The truck doors slammed behind him. The road to nowhere. The ride lasted hours. Daniel sat between 2 other detainees, a Japanese-American medic and a German-American radio operator. All 3 looked equally stunned. The windows were painted black from the inside. No one spoke. No one wanted to say anything that might be used against them. When the truck finally stopped, the engines cut off all at once, like someone had sliced the air. A guard yanked open the back door. Snowflakes drifted in, glowing under a floodlight. "Move," the guard ordered. They stepped into a clearing surrounded by pine forest. Ahead of them stood wooden towers, barbed wire fences, and rows of low buildings, silent, dark, and strangely new, as if constructed for a purpose too urgent and too shameful to announce. A steel sign near the entrance had no name, only numbers. Facility 24B, a place that, officially, did not exist. Inside the wire. Inside, Daniel and the others were processed like prisoners. Fingerprinting, confiscated belongings, file numbers assigned, interrogation rooms lined with one-way glass. A thin-faced officer greeted them with an unsettling calm. "You are being held for evaluation," he said. "Your loyalty is under review." Loyalty. The word stung more than any bullet ever could. "Sir," Daniel said cautiously, "I've served this country my whole life." "And that," the officer cut in, "is what we are here to confirm." They were escorted to their barracks, a long wooden building with a coal stove and narrow bunks stacked 3 high. Half the beds were already occupied. Some men looked terrified. Some looked defeated. Some stared blankly at the walls as if still trying to make sense of what had happened. The medic whispered, "What is this place?" Daniel answered honestly, "I don't know." But he had a feeling it was something the nation wasn't ready to admit existed. The interrogations. Every morning at dawn, MPs shouted names. Daniel was dragged into a room with blinding lights and a metal chair. They asked about his family's background, his childhood neighbors, his teachers, his books, his foreign language scores, his opinion of the president, his religious beliefs, his letters home, his conversations in the barracks, even the music he listened to. Nothing was too small, nothing was irrelevant, nothing was safe. Some questions were repeated deliberately, as if they expected his answers to eventually change. Some were asked to confuse him, some to bait him, some to push him. Have you ever criticized the war strategy? Have you ever read German literature? Do you sympathize with displaced Europeans? Would you report a fellow soldier? Would you question an order? Daniel learned there were no right answers, only answers that determined whether you were more or less of a threat. Every night he returned to the barracks mentally exhausted, unsure how much of himself he had surrendered.
The prison within the prison. Daniel soon realized Camp Briarwood wasn't only a detention site. It was a place where identities were dismantled. Men who spoke foreign languages were forbidden from doing so. Men with immigrant parents were questioned twice as often. Men with unusual skills, radio code breakers, linguists, engineers, were monitored constantly. One sergeant put it bluntly during meal hour. "They're not testing if you're loyal, they're testing how quickly you break." The camp had its own unwritten rules. Never speak too loudly. Never say anything that sounds like doubt. Never show fear, it makes you a target. And above all, never ask what happened to the men whose bunks suddenly went empty, because those men never returned. What the war didn't tell America. As months passed, Daniel uncovered pieces of the truth through overheard whispers and intercepted comments. Camp Briarwood was only one of several secret detention facilities. Soldiers from suspect backgrounds were taken there. Japanese-American medics, German-American linguists, Italian-American engineers, black soldiers accused without evidence, white soldiers who spoke foreign languages, anyone who questioned authority, anyone who read the wrong book at the wrong time, anyone who knew too much, anyone someone disliked. Not because they were guilty, but because the Army feared shadows more than facts. When the gate finally opened, by mid-1944, rumors spread that journalists were asking too many questions. Congressional aides were circulating memos. The War Department panicked. Suddenly, without announcement, Camp Briarwood began shutting down. Files were burned, barracks were emptied, detainees were reassigned to new units, quietly, discreetly, with no explanation. One morning, guards opened the gates and called Daniel's name. "You're being released," they said, as if he'd simply finished a training course. "Released to where?" Daniel asked. A shrug. "Someplace where no one will ask how long you've been gone." He was given a new uniform, a new assignment, and strict instructions. "Forget this place. Speak of it to no one." As Daniel walked out of Camp Briarwood for the last time, he looked back at the towers, the razor wire, the buildings that held so many stolen identities. Snow fell over the camp, soft and silent, erasing footprints,
as if trying to wipe history clean. But some things never disappear. The secret that refused to stay buried. Daniel survived the war. He built a life, but the memory of Briarwood followed him like a quiet ghost. For decades, he wondered how many others had been taken, how many stories had vanished, how many names had been erased, how many truths had been buried behind barbed wire. The camp was never officially acknowledged, no apology ever issued, no record ever admitted wrongdoing. But Daniel knew, hundreds of men knew, and secrets, no matter how deeply buried, never stay silent forever. Somewhere between the barbed wire and the classified files, the story of Camp Briarwood survived, not as a rumor, not as a myth, but as a reminder. Freedom can be fragile, and sometimes the deepest wounds are inflicted by the hand meant to protect you.
Brothers in captivity, courage, betrayal, and the fight to stay human. Among hunger, surveillance, and suspicion, unlikely alliances formed, revealing who stood firm, who broke, and who risked everything to protect one another. Survive, but never let them see you break. In the winter of 1944, when World War II was at its fiercest, the world believed American soldiers were held only in enemy camps across Europe and the Pacific. But deep in the mountains of Wyoming, far from prying eyes, stood a facility few Americans knew existed, a place where suspicion trumped justice, where hunger gnawed at resolve, and where loyalty was tested not by the enemy, but by the very nation the men had sworn to defend. That place was Alder Creek, and it was there that unlikely alliances formed, alliances forged not in glory, but in desperation. The night the gate closed behind them. Private Jamie Cooper would never forget the sound of the gate slamming shut, the metallic finality of it, the echo that seemed to follow him long after the guards walked away. Hours earlier, he had been a mechanic stationed at Fort Douglas. Now he stood inside a compound ringed with barbed wire, watchtowers, and floodlights that turned night into a pale imitation of day. Beside him were a dozen other soldiers, Japanese Americans, German Americans, linguists, mechanics, radio operators, all detained on grounds so vague even the guards struggled to justify them. "Welcome to Alder Creek," a sergeant growled. "Your loyalty is under review. Until we're satisfied, this is your home." Home. Jamie swallowed hard. He'd joined the army to fight tyranny, yet somehow here he was, locked behind American barbed wire. Hunger, surveillance, suspicion. The camp was barely functional when Jamie arrived. The barracks were drafty, the stew thin enough to see the bottom of the bowl, and the bunks crowded so tightly that men slept hip to hip. Hunger wasn't simply discomfort, it was control. Every movement was watched, every whispered conversation noted, every letter read, every expression interpreted. The MPs treated them like puzzle pieces they needed to arrange into loyal or disloyal. Camp Alder Creek didn't break you with brutality. It broke you with doubt. What did they suspect him of? Why was he here? Would they ever let him leave? These questions ate at him more than hunger ever could. The unlikely friendship. The man who saved Jamie from collapsing under suspicion was the last person he expected, Corporal Kenji Tanaka, a Japanese-American medic whose entire family had been sent to an internment camp months earlier. Jamie first met Kenji under a flickering bulb in Barracks 3. Jamie was shivering violently, part cold, part fear, when Kenji sat next to him on the bunk.
Your hands. You're shaking, Kenji murmured. I'm freezing, Jamie said, trying to laugh but failing. Kenji handed him a wool cap, thin, worn, mended several times. It's all I've got, but you need it more. Jamie hesitated. Won't you get cold? Kenji shrugged. We all get cold, but you look like you're about to fall over. He didn't know it then, but this quiet, soft-spoken medic would become his anchor. The shadow of betrayal. Not every man at Alder Creek was a brother. Some broke early, desperate for food, favor, or the smallest hint of leniency. They whispered to guards, traded names, exaggerated stories, invented accusations. One of them was Private Alan Brooks, a wiry, nervous man with darting eyes. Brooks had a way of appearing wherever trouble brewed, a way of listening without being noticed, a way of speaking to guards just out of earshot. Jamie sensed something off about him from the start. Kenji warned him outright. Watch Brooks. He's starving for something none of us can feed him. And Kenji was right. 2 days later, 3 men were dragged into solitary because Brooks had reported they expressed sympathy for the enemy. Their only crime had been speaking German while recalling childhood stories. From then on, Brooks was a ghost. Everyone saw him, everyone feared him, but no one trusted him. Suspicion didn't just creep into the camp, it walked the halls openly. The night of the riot. The turning point came on a night of biblical cold, a night the stove failed, the guards lost patience, and hunger gnawed the last of the men's restraint. Dinner was late. When it arrived, it was barely edible. A few men shouted complaints. A guard snapped back. It escalated quickly. A bowl shattered, a fist flew, a rifle butt cracked against someone's ribs. Jamie saw it unfolding like a slow-motion nightmare. Men surged toward the guard. Guards surged back. Angry voices filled the room. Then someone shouted, "Brooks started it. He told the guards we were plotting something." Brooks froze, eyes wide, trapped between both sides. Jamie's instincts took over. He grabbed Kenji's arm. "We need to stop this." Kenji nodded. Together they pushed through the chaos, shouting, "Enough! Stop! You're going to get someone killed!" But anger in captivity is a beast with its own mind. The MPs fired warning shots into the ceiling. Men dove for cover. Wood splintered. Debris rained down. Jamie shielded Kenji with his body as the room exploded into screaming and fear. Then a siren wailed, the camp's alarm. Just like that, it was over. The men were herded back into barracks. Several were injured. One was taken away on a stretcher. And Brooks was gone. No one knew where. But the damage had been done. Trust was now as thin as the soup they ate. The choice that changed everything. The next day, Jamie and Kenji were summoned to the interrogation building. They expected punishment. What they got instead was a test. An officer leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "You two tried to stop the riot. That shows initiative." Jamie's jaw tightened. "We didn't stop anything." "No," the officer said calmly, "but you tried. That matters." He slid 2 papers across the table. "Sign these statements. Confirm who started the riot. Confirm who resisted orders. Confirm who refused to cooperate." Jamie stared at the list of names. Some were men he barely knew. Some were innocent. Some had simply panicked. And at the bottom of the list was Kenji Tanaka. Jamie felt heat rise in his chest. "Why is Kenji's name here?" "Because we believe he fueled discontent," the officer said flatly. Kenji stiffened. "Sir, You both want to leave this camp eventually, don't you? This is how." Jamie's hands trembled. They wanted betrayal in exchange for freedom. Kenji looked at Jamie, eyes weary but calm. "Don't do it," Kenji whispered, "even if it means staying here longer." Jamie swallowed hard. Every man had a breaking point. This moment was his. He pushed the papers back across the table. "I won't sign." The officer's expression darkened. "Think carefully, Private Cooper." "I have," Jamie said. "This isn't loyalty. It's fear disguised as order." Kenji whispered, barely audible, "Thank you." The officer signaled the guards. "Take them back." The decision would cost them dearly, but it would bind them forever. Brothers, not prisoners. From that day on, Jamie and Kenji became inseparable. They shared rations, patched each other's clothes, protected each other during inspections, kept each other sane through the long, hopeless nights. Slowly, others followed their example. A black radio operator shared hidden bread. A German-born linguist taught English to a terrified Nisei youth. A Catholic chaplain led quiet, forbidden prayers at night. The camp tried to divide them. Fear tried to turn them against one another. Hunger tried to make them selfish. But something unexpected happened. Brotherhood grew in the cracks. Men who barely knew each other began forming invisible chains of loyalty, chains that no barbed wire could sever. The end of Alder Creek. By the spring of 1945, as the war neared its end, Washington grew uneasy. Complaints leaked through censored letters. A sympathetic officer whispered the truth to a journalist. Congressional murmurs began. Then suddenly, almost suspiciously, Alder Creek shut down. Men were reassigned quietly, scattered to other units. No explanations given, no apologies offered. Before Jamie left, he stood outside the barracks one last time. Snow melted slowly across the parade ground, dripping like memories refusing to stay buried. Kenji walked up beside him. "Do you think anyone will ever believe what happened here?" he asked softly. Jamie stared at the empty watchtower. "Someday," he said, "because we lived it, and because we survived it together." The lesson Alder Creek never wanted to teach. Years later, when the war was over and the world celebrated victory, Jamie would remember Alder Creek not for its barbed wire or its hunger, but for what it proved. That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing humanity even when the world punishes you for it. That betrayal is easy, but loyalty, the real kind, takes everything you've got. And that sometimes, in places meant to break them, men find something unbreakable: each other. Brothers not by blood, not by uniform, but by the simple, stubborn decision to stay human in a place designed to strip them of it. A freedom delayed. The return home that changed the nation. When the gates finally opened, these silent survivors carried home stories that shook America's conscience and reshaped its understanding of loyalty, justice, and liberty. Most Americans celebrated the victory of World War II with parades, music, and headlines that promised a new dawn. But in the quiet corners of the country, far from cheering crowds and confetti, there were men returning home who hadn't fought on foreign soil. They had fought for something far more fragile: the right to be American inside their own country. For them, the war didn't end when Germany surrendered or when the newsreels declared peace. Their freedom was delayed, suspended behind fences the public never saw, and locked inside files stamped secret. And when they finally emerged, The nation they returned to had no idea what they'd survived. The morning the gates opened at Camp Briarwood, there were no reporters, no families, no brass bands, just a single military truck delivering a final set of instructions and a stack of papers marked "Discharged without comment." Captain Thomas Hale was the first to step through the rusting gates. He was 32, but his hollow cheeks and sunken eyes made him look 20 years older. Before Briarwood, he'd been a respected artillery officer, fluent in German thanks to his immigrant grandparents, a skill that, ironically, had placed him under suspicion and landed him in a camp meant for internal evaluation. Behind him followed Private Samuel Ortiz, a Puerto Rican radio operator accused of unauthorized communications, though no evidence existed. And then Corporal Lawrence Booker, a black infantryman whose ability to speak French, learned from working in Louisiana port towns, had somehow branded him a potential foreign sympathizer. None of them had been charged with a crime. None had faced trial. And none had been told why they were released now. They were simply done with. The guards didn't shake hands. They didn't say goodbye. They just locked the gates, turned around, and walked back into the place that had stolen years no one would ever return. For a long time, the three men stood in silence on the empty road leading away from the camp. Their clothes hung loosely on their thin bodies. Their duffel bags contained nothing but a blanket, a pair of socks, and a copy of their discharge papers. Papers that didn't acknowledge Briarwood's existence. Samuel broke the silence first. "So, what now?" Lawrence answered with a humorless smile. "We go home and pretend none of this happened." Thomas clenched the papers in his fist. "No, we don't pretend." The wind swept across the open fields, carrying the scent of pine and rust. Freedom should have felt like sunlight breaking through a storm, but instead it felt fragile, like glass still cracking under their feet. They started walking. Their journey back into the world would become the beginning of a story that would shake the nation. Thomas Hale returned to Cleveland, where he found his family waiting with forced smiles and hesitant arms. They had been told he was completing extended intelligence work. They believed it, because believing anything else was too terrifying. But Thomas wasn't the same man who left. He couldn't sleep in a room with the door closed. He flinched at the sound of boots, and he spoke too carefully, as if the walls themselves were listening. 1 week after his return, he sat at the dinner table staring at a slice of bread. It was soft, white, fresh, so different from the stale ration bricks of briarwood that crumbled between his fingers like sand. His mother reached across the table. "Tommy, are you all right?" He dropped the bread. "No," he whispered. "I'm not." And for the first time, he told someone what had happened. The interrogations, the hunger, the darkness, the long nights where a single cough could be considered signals of conspiracy. His mother cried. His father shook with anger. His sister left the table speechless. But once the truth was spoken aloud, it could not be contained. In San Juan, Samuel Ortiz's return caused confusion. The army had told his family he'd gone missing in action. For 2 years they'd believed he was dead. His mother fainted when she saw him standing in the doorway, a ghost returned to flesh. But not everyone welcomed him. Rumors spread quickly. If he wasn't dead, people whispered, then where had he been? What had he done? Why didn't the army explain his absence? A neighbor muttered, "Maybe he did something. Maybe that's why they hid him." Samuel learned that sometimes freedom wasn't taken by barbed wire. Sometimes it was taken by gossip. He decided he wouldn't live behind silence anymore. He wrote a letter to a newspaper, then another. Most were ignored. One was published, buried deep inside the opinion section. That was enough. Other letters began arriving for him. Letters from men who had also vanished during the war. Men from camps Samuel had never heard of, but whose experiences echoed his own. He had stumbled onto a truth the government hoped would stay buried. Meanwhile, Lawrence Booker returned to Baton Rouge, only to find the country he had served with loyalty was still uncertain whether it wanted him as a citizen. A restaurant owner refused to serve him in his uniform. A streetcar conductor told him to sit in the back where you belong. A white veteran on the sidewalk called him a liar when Lawrence said he'd been imprisoned by his own government. "America doesn't lock up its own soldiers," the man barked. Lawrence met his eyes and said quietly, "Yes, it does." The man walked away. Lawrence kept talking. He spoke at churches, at union halls, at community gatherings. Not for sympathy, but for justice. He told people what hunger did to the mind, what isolation did to the soul, what surveillance did to trust. He wasn't alone for long. Thomas found him first. Samuel joined soon after. 3 men from 3 states, bound by a prison the nation didn't acknowledge. Their alliance became the spark no one could extinguish. In 1947, a congressional aide named Eleanor Price received a stack of classified memos about temporary internal detention centers and unverified loyalty evaluations. Buried in the memos was a name she had never seen before: Camp Briarwood, status closed. She began digging and uncovered records the War Department hoped would stay hidden. Surveillance logs, hunger reports, classified interrogations, psychological evaluations, and prisoner rosters. The rosters matched the names Thomas, Samuel, and Lawrence had spoken of. Eleanor did something few government workers dared to do. She reached out to the men themselves. The meeting took place in a small office in Washington, D.C. She arrived with files, they arrived with memories. When their testimonies merged with her documents, the truth became undeniable. America had held secret camps during the war, detaining its own citizens and soldiers under the guise of national security. Eleanor pushed for hearings. The War Department resisted. The press hesitated. Until one night, a reporter asked her the question that changed everything. "Why risk your career for this?" Eleanor answered, "Because a nation that hides the truth from itself can never truly be free." Her words became the headline that broke the silence. The story spread across newspapers, radio broadcasts, and dinner tables. Outrage grew. Veterans who had never spoken stepped forward with their own hidden scars. Citizens demanded accountability. Lawmakers called for investigations. For the first time, the country faced a truth uncomfortable and undeniable. Liberty had been denied in the very nation that claimed to defend it. Thomas, Samuel, and Lawrence testified before a congressional panel. Their voices did not shake. Their stories did not soften. And when the hearings ended, legislation was introduced to prevent the creation of secret military detention sites without judicial oversight. It was not enough to heal everything, but it was a beginning. Years later, when asked why they chose to speak when silence would have been easier, Lawrence answered on behalf of them all, "Because freedom delayed is freedom denied. And if we didn't tell the truth, then the fences we survived would stay standing forever inside other people." The nation didn't just hear their story. It changed because of it.